and used scientific laws to build magnificent temple machines that appeared to evoke the gods. Perhaps the most extraordinary story of innovation in an Alexandrian temple is that of the Serapeum, the temple founded by Ptolemy I in honor of the god Serapis.
The Serapeum at Alexandria was one of the great temples of the Mediterranean world. It lasted well into the Roman Empire and indeed survived until its destruction in or about 391 by the Christians.
The Temple of Serapis was a place of great spectacle.
The Serapeum was the biggest and the most famous temple in antique Alexandria. And unfortunately today there's not many remains. The only monument that is still standing on the site is the column that you see behind me. It's called the Pompey's Pillar. It was erected in Roman times.
But long before Pompey's Pillar was built next to the Serapeum, stories were circulating about extraordinary phenomena that took place there. These stories found their way into the works of the early Greek and Roman historians. One in particular described an iron chariot that flew through the air.
There is a tradition preserved in 4th and 5th century writers which speaks of the exploitation of the magnetic power of magnetite to create uncanny experiences in the temple. There's also talk in the writings of the Bishop of Carthage, Quodvald Deus, to the effect that an iron chariot could also be suspended in the same way.
Expert in the machines of the ancient past, Richard Windley is confident that the inventors of Alexandria understood the principles of magnetism.
Basically, the assumption is that the chariot was made of some sort of iron or ferrous material, and an enormous piece of lodestone would be hidden in the ceiling above, causing the chariot to effectively be suspended magically in the air with no apparent means of support.
In Athens, the Greek historian Ioannis Arvanitis is fascinated by these amazing stories.
To my mind, this was interesting but a little bit strange. A chariot in the middle of a temple floating in the air made no sense.
Arvanitis searched through early Greek writings and discovered 3 separate references to this astonishing flying chariot. He realized it referred to the god Serapis, who was equivalent to Apollo, the Greek god of the sun. It was commonplace in the Greek myths for Apollo the sun god to be represented as a driver of a 4-horse chariot called a quadriga. The quadriga rose from the sea and drove through the air. This image appeared in many places in antiquity, including the Parthenon.
The sun god needed his chariot to go up in the air. It was a very elaborate mechanism to make the believers think that the god was present there.
But what made this flying chariot even more remarkable was that the mechanism that made it levitate was timed precisely with the rotation of the sun.
In the eastern facade there was a very small window, and by, of course, the changing of the sun during the year, on this certain moment, one sunbeam could come in and touch the lips of the god Serapis.
When the doors were opened, they revealed the gigantic figure of Serapis on his throne. According to ancient writings, a small chariot driven by the sun god Helios was magically drawn towards the huge statue. The height of the ritual would be the moment when the sun shone into the temple and touched the face of Serapis. At this moment, the chariot would lift off the floor and levitate in front of the statue. It's thought that a huge piece of lodestone was set into the ceiling of the temple, and this magnetically attracted the small metal chariot. The texts of the time indicate that magnetism was used in the Serapeum, but could it actually have worked? 2,000 years later, modern toys illustrate how electromagnetic fields can be harnessed.
As you can see, there is no visible means of suspension whatsoever. You can actually pass your hand between the globe.
This little globe works according to the same principles as allegedly lifted the chariot of the sun god in the Serapeum.
Inside this toy there'll be a microprocessor and an array of what are called Hall effect sensors, which are sensing the magnetic field and the microprocessor will be balancing that magnetic field several thousand, if not tens or hundreds of thousands of times a second.
What makes the story of the chariot harder to dismiss is the fact that it's not the only such story. Other tales tell of the use of magnetism to create miraculous temple machines.
There is one reference to a temple in Alexandria where there were two statues, one of Mars and one of Venus, and at the height of the ceremonial the two statues were gradually brought together, and of course once they became within their magnetic field they were suddenly mutually attracted to one another and jumped to form a kind of embrace. We think that probably one of the statues was lodestone, the other may have been iron.
The Roman poet Claudian left a fascinating description of his Heros Gamos, or mystic marriage between Venus and Mars. But could the comparatively weak magnetic lodestone have caused a life-size chariot to rise?
There seems to be no doubt, because of the number of sources, that this object did exist, so the mystery really is how was it achieved. It's possible it could have been magnets, it would be nice to think that it was, but some kind of magical trickery, perhaps using suspension cables, is possibly the more likely idea.
However the chariot was suspended, it's certain that the ancients knew how to manipulate magnetism, but this was by no means the full extent of their inventiveness. Across the ancient world, magnificent temples were built in honor of the gods. They were beautifully designed and adorned with statues and pillars. Inside the temples were an array of weird and wonderful machines, each competing to be the most spectacular.
For the classical period, it was very important to the priests and temples to attract the crowds, and once the crowds were in there, to give them a fabulous show.
The greatest inventor of the ancient world was Heron of Alexandria. The vast number of inventions that Heron designed and documented were intended for use in temples. Heron would have been well paid by the priests to produce increasingly outlandish and shocking inventions. He often used hydraulics in his creations, combining heat from fires to generate water, air and steam pressure.
Heron of Alexandria believed in the elasticity of air. He knew the air had substance, it had volume, it was made of particles, and if you pushed it, it would have to go somewhere, and if you sucked it, it would come with you. So these were very important things for him.
One of Heron's favorite tricks was to combine engineering with the practice of making a sacrifice to the gods. He used the fire that had been kindled on an altar as a source of power for his machine. The altar would have been transparent, made of either glass or horn. When the fire was lit, the statues were seen to dance. Through the heart of the altar was a tube which turned on a pivot. Connected to this tube were smaller tubes lying at right angles to each other and bent at the extremities. When the sacrifice was kindled, the air would grow warmer. The hot air would be forced out through the large tube and into the smaller ones. The air, working like steam power, would create enough force to cause the tube and the dancing figures to revolve. When the altar flames started to die down, the dancing figures would slow and eventually come to a halt. Heron's altar with its moving figures would cause him to become a sensation in the ancient world, sought out by every priest in Alexandria.
Many of his devices and inventions moved statues, and as a consequence they could be used by the religious priests of the time to convince the people that came to the temples that the gods really existed.
Worshippers who entered the temples of the time would have to pay for certain services, like holy water. Thus, Heron designed the first ever vending machine. It was a simple yet ingenious device, and one that generated vast amounts of money for the priests. The worshipper placed a bronze coin into the slot of the machine. In return, they received a small amount of holy water for the ritual washing of their face and hands before entering the temple. The coin fell into a small pan that hung from one end of a delicately balanced beam. Its weight depressed one end of the beam so that the other end rose. This opened a valve and allowed the holy water to flow out.
I should have thought that the priests would have leapt at the chance to use such an expert at things mechanical as Heroin. The man was clearly a mechanical genius. There were all sorts of things that he was